Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're going to untangle a really complex, honestly kind of misunderstood phenomenon, speaking in tongues. We'll dig into its ancient roots, unpack the theological debates that literally divide modern congregations, and, this is the coolest part, look at the hard neurological science of what's actually happening in the brain. So let's just dive right in with the million-dollar question, right? What exactly is happening, both physically and spiritually, when someone speaks in tongues? Whether you've grown up seeing it in a charismatic church, read about it in a textbook, or just scrolled past a clip of it on social media, it's a deeply embodied practice that just looks and feels incredibly unique. Okay, first things first, we need to lay down a definition. The academic term here is glossolalia. Basically, it's the production of these rhythmic, unrecognized sounds. The scholars say it involves vocalizing syllables that don't have any recognizable semantic content or grammar. To you or me observing, it might sound exactly like a foreign language, but for the person speaking, it usually feels completely uncontrolled, like they're just channeling the sounds rather than consciously thinking them up. Now, we absolutely have to separate glossolalia from another term, xenoglossia. This comes from the Greek words for foreigner and tongue. Xenoglossia is the miraculous ability to speak a real, known human language, like, say, fluent Mandarin or Latin, that you have literally never studied. Keeping this distinction in mind is absolutely crucial for the historical debates we're about to get into.
All right, here is our roadmap for today. Number 1, the origins of glossolalia. Number 2, the theological divide. 3, the charismatic perspective. 4, the cessationist critique. And finally, number 5, the science of tongues.
Section 1, the origins of glossolalia. Let's trace where this all started. The story actually traces way back to an ancient Israelite harvest festival called Pentecost. But the big moment? Fast forward to AD 3. The biblical book of Acts describes the apostles being empowered by this rushing wind and tongues of fire to speak real foreign languages to a huge international crowd. Then, the timeline jumps dramatically to the early 1900s in America. You have figures like Charles Parham and the Azusa Street Revival, which basically launched a massive global movement. At first, these early Pentecostals actually thought they were getting xenoglossia, missionary tongues, to go preach in unlearned languages like Chinese. But when those foreign translations didn't quite pan out, they began to understand it more as a private, heavenly language.
Moving on to Section 2, the theological divide. Because, as it turns out, modern Christians are deeply, deeply divided on what this practice actually means today. You can really clearly contrast the two major camps here. On one side, we have the charismatic or continuationist view. They believe speaking in tongues is an active, continuing spiritual gift. It's meant for personal edification, deep spiritual connection, and prayer. On the flip side, directly opposing that, is the cessationist view. They argue that the genuine gift of foreign languages was a specific, first-century miracle meant only to validate the early church, and that it has definitively 100% ceased. All right, Section 3, the charismatic perspective. Let's look at how the practitioners actually understand their own experiences. New Testament scholar Dr. Craig Keener gives us a great look at how this works internally. He points out that, according to the Apostle Paul, praying in tongues actually bypasses the cognitive mind to allow the Spirit to pray. Keener notes that this engages the affective or emotional part of a person. It's like it gets past all our human defense mechanisms. For the people doing it, especially if maybe they're introverted or just less intellectually articulate, it provides this really simple, direct, and incredibly cathartic way to pray.
Okay, Section 4, the cessationist critique. Let's objectively examine the other side of the aisle. Cessationist leaders, like theologian John MacArthur, staunchly argue that modern glossolalia just does not match up with the biblical record. His point is that the true biblical gift was always a known language that could be objectively, miraculously translated. MacArthur points out that modern tongues simply don't pass that test. He argues it's basically just a learned behavior, a kind of phonetic gibberish that's just developed its own internal lingo over time, rather than an actual supernatural event. Now, what's really fascinating here is that both sides debate the rules using the exact same biblical texts. The folks over at the Remnant Radio highlighted this perfectly. The Apostle Paul laid out these really strict biblical rules in 1 Corinthians 14. He said that for public use, there absolutely must be a spiritual interpreter present so the whole church gets built up. If there's no interpreter, the speaker has to stay silent. Paul explicitly says that praying in a tongue leaves the mind unfruitful. But, and this is a big but, he famously wraps up with a strict instruction: do not forbid speaking in tongues. Section 5, the science of tongues. This is where we leave the theological debate entirely behind and look at the actual physical reality using linguistics and neuroscience.
Linguistically speaking, the research here is absolutely fascinating. Studies show that people speaking in tongues don't just invent entirely new grammars out of thin air. Instead, as the educational channel Religion for Breakfast points out, they draw overwhelmingly from the sounds, or what linguists call the phoneme inventory, of the native languages they already speak. So, to put that into perspective, an English speaker who is speaking in tongues isn't going to miraculously start using native Mandarin vocalizations, like that really specific aspirated Q sound. No, they'll stick to familiar English sounds, like the TH sound. This basically proves that the practice, whatever its spiritual origin might be, is structurally bound by the existing neural pathways in the speaker's brain. Neurologically, producing these rapid, rhythmic syllables without any real grammar takes an immense amount of cognitive effort. See, our brains are hardwired to make meaningful language. To speak in tongues, you have to actively suppress that natural urge. Think of a toddler who just blurts things out because they haven't developed a filter yet. That filter is known as response inhibition. Well, glossolalists have to intentionally bypass that exact filter. They use intense executive control to continuously fire off syllables while actively avoiding forming real words. And here is where it gets crazy. MRI scans show that frequent practitioners literally experience neuroplasticity. A 2020 study found that regular glossolalists actually have increased gray matter volume in 2 specific regions of the frontal lobe. And get this, these are the exact same cognitive centers used for language, multitasking, and interference suppression by simultaneous interpreters working at the United Nations. How wild is that? To top it off, a really comprehensive study over in Budapest compared glossolalia practitioners to a control group and also to patients with schizophrenia. They completely decoupled the practice from mental illness. Using cognitive tests, like making subjects assign emotions to moving geometric shapes, they measured something called mentalization, which is basically your ability to read complex emotions. They found that glossolalists actually have an incredibly high capacity to recognize complex human mental states. They lean into what's called hypermentalization, which completely shatters the stereotype that speaking in tongues is some kind of dissociative break from reality. So whether you're looking at glossolalia through the lens of a cessationist, a charismatic, a linguist, or a neuroscientist, it undeniably reveals the sheer adaptive power of the human brain. It's this intricate neurological marvel wrapped up in deep cultural and historical roots. The science is pretty clear on how the brain pulls us off. But as for the ultimate question of what the spirit is actually trying to say, well, we'll leave that up to you to ponder.